Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Keith, aka KBev from KBev Photo. One of the things I usually do when I talk with different photographers is ask them about their workflow. And so I figured I'd create a 15 or 20-minute video that summarizes my workflow that I've refined and tweaked over the last 10, 15 years. One of the things that I really like about it is that it allows me to work through photos quickly by doing things in batches, so I can always stop and pick back up where I left off without skipping a beat. Now, to be honest, I usually tweak my workflow a lot as I learn new steps and think about different ways to improve it and save myself some time. The session I recorded was actually from October of 23, and I've made a bunch of changes and also improved my editing skills in Photoshop a lot since then. The workflow is basically the same, so I figured I'd keep the video and maybe I'll just add a few comments where there's a big change from what you're seeing on the screen to what I actually do today. But let's get into it. For better or worse, there's about 14 steps to my workflow. The first thing I do when I get home is import everything to my desktop and usually grab something to eat while I wait for the previews to generate. Then I come back and remove all the junk and back everything up to my website unedited to a private gallery. This way my clients can select their pictures if they want, or I'll just have them there safely in case something happens. Then I pick my favorites and select my finalists for editing. We'll get into it in more detail in this video, but once I'm done selecting my finalists, I spend a lot of time cropping them, I do some big global edits in Lightroom, and then I do a quick review before going to Photoshop to do some of the heavy lifting. When I'm done with Photoshop, I come back, I tag all my photos, and review them one last time before I upload them to a finished gallery for the website. Then I select the subset that I want to post on Instagram and drop those into a Dropbox folder, and then I move and set up my text replacements so that I have my hashtags ready to go. All right, one last thing before we get started. I'm a photographer, not a videographer, and definitely not a video editor. This is going to be pretty rough, and I'm going to use just the basics of iMovie because that's kind of where we're at. All right, with that as the disclaimer, let's get into it. All right, step one is importing the photos into Lightroom and letting the previews build. Shout out to Lisa, who was the last model I worked with before I imported this session with Des and Asher. I'm also going to keep a timer going somewhere in here so that you can get a sense of when I'm speeding things up as to how long the entire session is taking, how long the steps are taking as I go through the photos. All right, for step two, I usually just try and remove the junk. I set the filtering to unflagged photos, and if you've let the previews build, it goes pretty quickly. I just remove everything that's out of focus, where somebody blinked, or I just don't like the pose or the test shots, and it goes pretty quickly. Once I'm done, I delete those from the drive, remove them from Lightroom, and I'm good to go to the next step. Okay, the next step in the process is what I call pre-backup. I have cloud backups, I have redundant drives here, and I have plenty of physical copies of my stuff, but I still like to put everything on my SmugMug website so that I can proof them and have a copy to share if the models want to see all the pictures. That goes pretty quickly. I think in the video here I was using the Jeffrey Friedel plugin for SmugMug, but now I'm using the regular Lightroom plugin for SmugMug. It's pretty seamless, and I just upload everything there so I have a clean copy of everything before I start editing. Okay, step four in the process is all about picking my favorites. You can't see the second monitor. What you see is the grid view in the video, but I have two 27-inch monitors here so I can see the photos up close and see what's sharp, see what little nuances I really want to keep. I don't have to pick my absolute favorite here. I'm just trying to down select from the whole session down to my favorite photos. I usually hit Shift N so that I can compare side by side as well. I usually have the filter stay as unflagged, so as I pick my favorites, they leave the screen and I move on. Okay, step 5 in the process is what I like to think of as final selection. I usually have to delete one or two that I missed from earlier, but here in this session, I had 44 photos that I thought were good enough to use. So I'm going to go through them all, and when I see poses that are similar or pictures that are similar, I'm going to force myself to choose one. As I do that, I'll mark them with 1 or 2 stars and unflag them since I have the filter still on. That removes them from my view so that I could just see the ones that I've chosen. As you can see, I probably filtered out about 3 or 4 more in this stage, and then I'm ready to start editing. Step 6 in the process is one of the things I've developed over time that really does help me move through my workflow quickly. Basically, what I do is I filter on all the portrait style photos. I crop them to 4:5 without adjusting anything. I just go with the default cropping, which works for almost none of the pictures. And then I sync that across all of the portrait photos. And then what I do is I go back and crop them the way I want them and angle them the way I want them so that the composition is the best I think it should be. Now, once I'm done doing all the portrait photos, I do the same thing for all the landscape photos and get those exactly where I want them to be as well. At the end of this step, which actually goes pretty quickly when you do them all at once, I have all the photos that I've chosen that are my favorites that I'm going to edit, cropped the way I want them. And what I usually do is flag them as red if I know they need to go to Photoshop next, or I flag them as yellow if I'm pretty sure I can do all the editing I need to do in Lightroom. Okay, for step 7, I actually start doing my high-level edits. Since this was a Halloween session, I didn't do the red and yellow in step 6 like I said I would, but instead, I figured I'd try and apply the presets and get some of the color effects I wanted to create the Halloween vibe we were going for. I applied some of the basic settings, exposure, shadows, clarity, vibrance. I also did some quick editing to remove some lint from the clothing, and then I went yellow for things that could be finished in Lightroom and red for things that needed to be finished in Photoshop. For step 8, I actually paused and do a quick review. I'm only about 45 minutes into editing from this session, and I've gotten a lot done already. I ditched the junk, I uploaded it back up to the cloud, I chose my favorites, I actually cropped all of them, and then I went through each one and did my initial edits and ID'd the ones that needed to go to Photoshop. For this session, I had 41 photos that I chose to be finalists, 19 needed to go to Photoshop, and 22 I was pretty sure I could finish in Lightroom. Once I decided which photos needed to go to Photoshop and marked them red, I had the yellow or unlabeled photos ready to go and ready to edit in Lightroom. So I spent some time going through and doing a lot of the global edits there, adjusting the colors, adjusting the highlights, making sure that the photo looked the way I liked. And when this process was said and done, I know I'd be left with just the photos that were red that needed to go to Photoshop for the heavy lifting. Okay, at this stage of the process, I have a good sense of how much work I have left. I can look at the number of red photos and know if I have a couple of hours left or if I have a couple of days left. But at this stage of the game, I'm going to Photoshop and I'm doing the frequency separation to do all the photo retouching and fine tuning that I want, as well as using Photoshop's AI tools, thankfully, to remove things in the background like wires or marks on the floor or marks on the walls to make sure that the final product is a clean product. Okay, I'll let some of these parts run so that you can see what I'm actually doing. But when I go to Photoshop, there's a couple things I do up front. I do some of the spot removal and spot healing tools that I want to use if there's a piece of hair or something else that I want to remove from the photo that I didn't do in Lightroom. I'll also use the generative AI tools to remove some things that I find distracting in the photos. After that, I flatten all the layers and then I go to frequency separation, which is an action I have set up to do the skin retouching and make sure the photo looks great. I'm going to skip through most of the editing that I did in Photoshop because everybody has their own religion about how they do it. There's a lot of ways to do things, like for here, I'm removing a piece of hair that I found distracting. You can remove it probably 20 different ways in Photoshop, but for a photo that was probably going to get posted on Instagram, it was a full body shot, this worked fine and Des was happy with it. Okay, for this particular session, I had to take a little bit of a detour. I didn't like the fact that you could see their faces through the holes in the pumpkin that were carved out, so I decided to take a little bit of time and go in and color them all black. I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to do this, but the way I did, I liked the finished result and it worked. If you have suggestions, feel free to drop them in the chat, but let's roll through this part too. On the plus side, after doing so many of these things, I got pretty quick at it by the end, and the result was looking good, and it wasn't taking me nearly as long as it was the first couple of times. I know this might be a little bit hard to follow, but by the time I'm done doing all of my Photoshop editing, I have twice as many red photos in Lightroom as I started with. I have all the original red photos that I sent to Photoshop, and then I have all the TIFF files that came back from Photoshop on top of that. So what I basically do is one at a time go through and make the TIFF files yellow for final review and unflag the red ones so that the red unflagged photos in my Lightroom catalog I know are the originals that somehow ended up edited later on. Okay, step 10. At this stage of the game, all my photos have been edited, sent to Photoshop if they needed to be, and they're labeled yellow in Lightroom. With the yellow labels, I go through and do one final pass, making final adjustments, making sure I didn't miss anything, and then I make sure I add all the keywords and tagging that I want to add and flip them to green. Once they're green, they're ready for uploading. Okay, step 11, I basically upload the final product to a public gallery on my website. My naming conventions are a little bit different, so I can keep track of what's what in this case. The ones that start with month, month, year, year are the unedited photos. The ones that are named with the month and year in parentheses afterwards are the edited photos. That's how I can tell which photo gallery has my edited ones and which one has the raw originals. Okay, step 12. While step 11's uploads are happening, I actually go back through the final products one more time to pick the photos that I want to share on social media. For those, I actually give them 3 stars. This way I know that those are the ones that I am sharing, and in looking back at my galleries, I know which ones I have shared. Okay, step 13 is basically taking the photos from step 12 and exporting them using a preset that I have set up to send those directly to Dropbox. I don't think that's what I was doing in 2023 when I recorded this video. I was sending them to an intermediate place first, but essentially what I'm doing is taking all the photos that I plan to share at Instagram at some point in the future and putting them in a Dropbox folder so I can upload them whenever I feel like it from my phone. I also changed the file names to describe the session that's represented in the photos. Okay, step 14 is a step that might go too far for some of you. But what I essentially do is take all the files that I exported to Dropbox with a unique file name, let's say in this case it was Halloween, and then I go in my iPhone and set up IG Halloween in the text replacement functions, and then that replaces that phrase with all of the hashtags and descriptions that I want to use for that photo session. Once this step is done and it's set up, I actually drag the files from my desktop to my external drive where it's backed up with a RAID array and good to go. One final step for me that most people won't need to do is going through and setting up the gallery on my website. I tend to feature my most recent gallery posts on the main page of my website, so when I'm done uploading and moving everything around on the home computer, I do go to the website and configure everything the way I want it to be, so that when you visit kbevphoto.com, you see my latest work right there on the home page and everything is tagged and ready to go. Okay, well that's a good summary of my workflow using Photoshop, Lightroom, SmugMug, and Dropbox for when I get home from each session. The video is probably about 18 months old as I'm recording this overview, so some of the nuances of each step have changed, but my basic workflow is the same. It gets me through sessions pretty quickly, and it allows me to stop at any point in my editing process and pick up exactly where I left off without skipping a beat. So if it's going to take me several days, I don't get lost on where I was. Hope that's helpful. Peace.